I've always been fascinated by cryptids, those creatures that lurk on the edge of science, hidden away in the dark corners of the world. My curiosity led me to become a cryptozoologist, dedicated to proving the existence of beings dismissed by many as myths. That was until I encountered something that shook my skepticism to its core. It began on a cold, foggy night in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, a region infamous for sightings of Bigfoot and other less-known entities. My team and I were camped near an old, derelict cabin miles from the nearest town. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and pine, and the only sounds were the occasional drops of water falling from the dense canopy above. Our equipment was scattered around the small clearing, infrared cameras pointing towards the tree-lean, audio recorders set to capture any unusual sounds. We sat around the fire, exchanging stories of strange encounters and unexplained phenomena. That's when the first howl ripped through the night. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, a deep, mournful wail that seemed to vibrate in my chest. We scrambled to our equipment, checking the monitors for any signs of movement. The thermal cameras showed nothing but the cold outlines of trees and underbrush. The howling continued, now joined by a chorus of otherworldly cries that didn't sound like any animal I knew. The air grew colder, and a dense mist began to roll in from the forest, enveloping us in a damp, chilling embrace. I peered into the mist, trying to make sense of the shapes that seemed to shift and move just beyond my vision. My colleague, Mark, gripped my arm. "Do you see that?" he whispered, pointing into the fog. I strained my eyes and, for a moment, thought I saw a figure, tall and impossibly thin, with limbs that twisted unnaturally. As quickly as it appeared, it vanished, swallowed up by the fog. We exchanged a look of silent agreement and decided to investigate. Equipped with headlamps and heavy-duty flashlights, we ventured into the woods, the ground soft and yielding under our boots. The forest was alive with sounds, the usual nocturnal chorus replaced by whispers that seemed to echo from every direction. The deeper we went, the more disoriented I became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their gnarled branches like twisted hands reaching out. Suddenly, Mark stopped. He was staring at something on the ground, his face pale in the light of his headlamp. I moved closer and felt a surge of fear when I saw what he was looking at, a footprint, but unlike any I had seen before. It was too large for a human, the toes elongated and the shape all wrong for any bear. "We need to follow it," Mark said, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, though every instinct was screaming at me to run. We continued, following the strange tracks that seemed to appear and disappear at random, leading us deeper into the forest. The cries had stopped now, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed in on us from all sides. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in my ears, and the soft crunch of our footsteps, the only proof that time hadn't stopped altogether. Then, without warning, the ground beneath us gave way. I heard Mark shout as he fell, and then a sickening thud. I scrambled to the edge of the newly formed pit, my heart pounding as I shone my light down. Mark was lying motionless at the bottom, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Panic surged through me as I called his name, but he didn't respond. I needed to get help, but the thought of leaving him there alone was unbearable. As I hesitated, a shadow moved across the edge of the pit. I looked up, my light catching the outline of a figure standing on the opposite side. It was humanoid, but grotesquely misshapen, its eyes reflecting the light with an eerie glow. It stared at me for a moment before turning and disappearing into the forest. I was left there, frozen in fear, my mind struggling to process what I had just seen. The realization that we were not alone, that the legends might be more than just stories, was terrifying. I knew I had to act quickly. Mark's life depended on it. I secured a rope to a nearby tree and lowered myself into the pit. Mark was unconscious but alive. I checked his leg and knew immediately that he couldn't walk, his ankle was clearly broken. I shouted for help, hoping that our team back at the camp would hear me. But as I waited for a response, a low growl echoed through the trees, a sound so menacing it chilled me to the bone. Something was out there, watching, waiting. The growl grew louder, closer, until it was nearly upon us. I grabbed Mark, trying to shield him with my body, when suddenly, lights flashed through the trees, voices calling our names. Our team had found us, drawn by my shouts. They helped us out of the pit and back to the camp. Mark was airlifted to the nearest hospital, and I was left to explain what had happened. But how could I? How could I tell them that the creature of legend, the thing we had been searching for, was not just a myth? How could I admit that our pursuit of knowledge had led us into a nightmare? We packed up our camp the next day, the forest now silent as if nothing had ever disturbed its peace. But I knew better. I had seen the impossible, felt its gaze upon me. And as we drove away, I looked back at the shadowed woods, a shiver running down my spine. I thought leaving the forest would ease the dread that had settled over me, but it clung like a second skin, a constant reminder of what we had experienced. Back in the city, the normality of everyday life seemed surreal, almost mocking in its disregard for the terror that now haunted my nights. Mark was in recovery, his physical injuries healing far quicker than the psychological scars we both bore. We met often, trying to piece together the fragments of our encounter, each meeting an attempt to validate our experience. It wasn't just the fear of what we saw, it was the gnawing realization that our understanding of the world was fundamentally flawed. It's like the more we talk about it, the less real it seems, Mark said during one of our discussions. But the fear in his eyes told a different story. Determined to find some answers, I began diving into cryptid research with a fervor that bordered on obsession. My apartment was strewn with books, old newspapers, and interview transcripts from those who claimed to have seen similar creatures. One story, in particular, caught my attention, a tale from an old logger named Jebediah who had encountered a shadow man in the same woods over 50 years ago. Jebediah described it as a tall, thin figure that seemed to blend with the trees, with eyes that glowed like coals. He believed it was a guardian of the forest, a spirit that protected the land from intruders. His story ended with a warning: those woods belong to it, and woe to anyone who dares to defy its watch. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had indeed trespassed into a realm that was not ours to explore. The idea nagged at me, an itch that no amount of rational thought could soothe. I decided I needed to speak with Jebediah himself. Perhaps he could offer some insight, some way to understand what we had encountered. Tracking him down was easier than I expected. He lived in a small cabin on the outskirts of the town nearest to where we had camped. The local people knew him as an eccentric, but crazy old man from the woods, and they advised me to take his stories with a grain of salt. But I was beyond skepticism. The drive to his cabin was long, the roads rough and winding. When I finally arrived, the sun was setting, casting long shadows that twisted the trees into grotesque shapes. Jebediah's cabin was exactly as I had imagined, old, weathered, surrounded by towering pines that swayed in the wind. Jebediah was surprisingly hospitable, his eyes bright with curiosity when I told him why I had come. "You've seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low and raspy. I nodded, and his face grew somber. "Then you know why you must never go back." We sat by the fireplace, the flames casting flickering shadows across the room. Jebediah recounted tales of the forest and its spirit, each story more unnerving than the last. He spoke of people who had gone missing, hikers who had ventured too deep into the woods and never returned. "It's not just protecting the land," he explained. "It's keeping something there, something it doesn't want to escape." His words sent chills down my spine. "What is it protecting?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Jebediah looked into the fire, his face haunted by memories. There's a darkness in those woods, a curse that dates back generations. That creature, that shadow man, it's bound to the curse, forever guarding it. Anyone who encounters it risks awakening what lies beneath. The wind howled outside, a mournful sound that seemed to echo Jebediah's words. I felt a sense of impending doom, a realization that this was far bigger than any cryptid hunt. This was about something ancient, something evil. As the night grew darker, the howling of the wind stronger, Jebediah's stories became more fragmented, more frantic. He spoke of signs and omens, of dreams filled with warnings. "It's coming," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You've stirred it, and now it knows you." The fire flickered, casting a brief shadow across the room. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing by the window, tall and thin, watching us. I blinked, and it was gone. I turned to Jebediah, but he was staring into the fire, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Jebediah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He didn't respond, his gaze fixed on something only he could see. The cabin felt colder, the air thicker. I stood up, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to run from whatever was coming. But before I could move, the window shattered, a cold wind blowing in, carrying with it the faint sound of whispers and a chill that settled deep in my bones. Outside, the forest seemed to come alive, shadows moving, converging towards the cabin. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. "Jebediah!" I shouted, but he remained motionless, lost in his trance. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that seemed to call my name. As the shadows reached the edge of the light cast by the cabin, I realized that the story was far from over. We were not just observers, we had become part of the legend, entangled in its curse. The true horror of what lurked in the forest was still unfolding, and I feared what it would bring with it into the light. Jebediah suddenly snapped to attention, his eyes focusing on mine with an urgency that made my spine tingle. "You must leave now," he hissed, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "But remember this, you're marked now. You've seen its face, and it won't rest until it's drawn you back or driven you mad." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. As I backed towards the door, the wind whipped violently around the cabin, the shadows swirling like dark smoke against the glass. It felt as if the forest itself was alive, angry, and reaching for me. With one last look at Jebediah, who now seemed to shrink back into the shadows, as though becoming part of them, I turned and fled into the night. The drive back was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every rustle of the trees, every shift in the shadows by the roadside seemed to signal pursuit. I was afraid to look into the rearview mirror, fearing I would catch sight of those haunting, glowing eyes. By the time I reached the safety of my apartment in the city, the first light of dawn was breaking, but the relief I felt was tinged with an unshakable dread. In the following days, I tried to return to my normal life, but the terror of that night clung to me like a second skin. I jumped at shadows, at the slightest unusual sound. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it brought no rest, only nightmares filled with dark forests and haunting, whispering voices. One evening, as I sat trying to drown my fears in mindless television, a knock at my door made me jump. I opened it to find an old woman, her eyes wise and sad. "You don't know me," she said, "but Jebediah was my brother. He sent me to give you this." She handed me a small, leather-bound book. "He's gone," she added simply, turning to walk away before I could ask any questions. Trembling, I opened the book. It was Jebediah's journal, filled with decades of research, encounters, and theories about the creature and the curse of the forest. As I read, I realized he had dedicated his life to protecting others from the fate he'd ultimately accepted for himself. The final entry was dated just a day before my visit. "I have done all I can to keep it at bay," he wrote, "but I fear it grows stronger." Whoever reads this, know that the only way to end the curse is to face it, to go into the heart of the forest under the dark of the moon and confront it. Only then will the shadows disperse. I knew then what I had to do. The thought terrified me, but the resolve that hardened in my chest felt like the last piece of Jebediah's legacy. I had to finish what he started, not just for my own sake, but for all those who had suffered because of the shadow in the woods. Weeks later, under a moonless sky, I stood at the edge of the forest, the trees whispering as if in warning. With every step into the darkness, my heart pounded louder, but I pushed forward, driven by a desperate need for closure. The deeper I went, the colder it got, until the air felt like ice in my lungs. Shadows danced around me, and whispers filled the air, growing louder, more insistent. "Turn back," they seemed to say, but I pressed on until I reached the clearing where I had first heard the creature's haunting cries. There, in the center of the clearing, the shadows coalesced into a tall, thin figure, its eyes glowing red in the darkness. "Why have you come?" it hissed, its voice a chilling blend of curiosity and menace. "To end this," I replied, my voice steady despite the terror gripping me. "To free us both from this curse." The creature studied me, its head tilting as if considering my words. Then, slowly, it nodded. "Very well," it whispered, and the air around us began to shimmer, the shadows receding like a tide going out. The creature's form became less defined, fading until all that was left were the glowing eyes, which blinked once, twice, then disappeared. As the first light of dawn touched the trees, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The forest seemed just a forest again, the air fresh and clean. I walked out into the new day, knowing that the nightmare was finally over, that the shadows had dispersed, and that in confronting my fear, I had found an unexpected strength. The curse was broken, the forest at peace, and though I would carry the scars of that night forever, I knew I had done what was necessary. I had faced the darkness, and in doing so, had brought light back into the world.